The story of a girl who grew up in a family without warmth and attention, learned to live in silence and loneliness, and over time began to look for herself outside this environment. In the town of West Curran in western North Carolina, people lived without haste. They put their hands in the ground, knew when rain was coming, and called birds differently than they did in other places. The road that led to Frances's house had once been gravel, but over the years it had become overgrown with grass, and now it resembled a path in a field that had not been walked for a long time. Frances was born in this house, although she never considered it her own. Her childhood was spent in dry conversation and endless attempts to be noticed. Her mother, Janet, was not cruel, but she was empty. Her attention was focused on what others might say, teachers, neighbors, friends at church. What happened inside the house mattered only when it could be discussed in public. Her father was quiet. He worked in a sawmill and brought home the smells of tar and sawdust and loss. He rarely intervened, and when he did, it was only to keep things from getting worse. Frances learned not to ask. She cleaned up after herself, sat quietly at family gatherings, and didn't expect presents on birthdays. She had few friends. Mostly, they were teachers who noticed her neat notebooks and clean language. She loved the silence because it didn't require explaining. After graduating from high school, she left. Not to another city, but to another life. Her name disappeared from mailing lists, and then from the conversations of her neighbors. Janet said that her daughter took her cue from the TV and decided to become someone she would never be. But Frances didn't return because she wanted fame. She simply wanted a place that would be hers alone. Her path was not easy. First, a college degree, a job in a coffee shop, then an unexpected invitation to a project. Her ability to see structure where others saw chaos led her to architecture. She created spaces that felt alive. People began to seek her out. Then came contracts, recognition, awards, her own studio. She didn't talk about it at home. When Frances bought a house in Washington state, an old farmhouse that had been converted with intelligence and tenderness, she felt something like belonging. The windows looked out onto a valley, and in the morning the rooms were filled with light that moved so slowly, as if on purpose. She planted herbs, walked barefoot on the house's wooden floor. And for the first time in years she didn't wake up with her teeth clenched. Several years passed. Her mother reappeared in her life unexpectedly. First, a brief letter. Then a call she didn't answer. Then a letter with the caption, "I know where you are." And one day, while Frances was working in the yard, an old gray car pulled up to her gate. It was Janet, with a bag, a narrow gaze, and the same voice that sounded like it came from someone else's room. The mother stayed in the house for several days. She examined the furniture, touched things, silently appraised them. She talked about how much effort she had put into her daughter, how many times she had sacrificed herself, how hard it was for her to raise someone so stubborn. Frances didn't argue. She knew the conversation was a trap. Janet told the neighbors that she had come to see what her child had done. And she added that she planned to stay. That this house was hers too. Because, after all, if it weren't for her, there would be no Frances. One morning, the mother began gathering documents. She needed copies of the property, contracts, records. She asked how the land was registered, whose name was on the plot. Her voice grew louder, her movements faster. She no longer walked, but moved as if everything was already hers. She talked about changing addresses, re-registrations. Her eyes did not ask. Frances watched this with the same silence she had learned to maintain as a child. She did not shout, she did not explain. She simply disappeared for a few hours in the workshop, for long walks into the city without a phone. She let her mother's movements pass, like a storm passes when you do not open the windows. When her mother finally left, the air in the house felt heavy. Everything remained where it was, but each object seemed to have changed weight. Frances cleaned the room she had lived in, washed the windows, opened all the doors, but the shadow Janet had brought with her would not go away. Her mother promised to return. She said that nothing was settled yet. She said she had a right. After her visit, the mail came more often. Letters of demand, copies of appeals, notices of the opening of the case. Janet filed a lawsuit. The documents stated that the house had been purchased thanks to investments made in her daughter during her lifetime and that the mother had legal grounds to demand a share of the property. She spoke of moral compensation, of debt, of a shared history. Her voice now echoed in the dry formulations of legal papers. Frances did not answer immediately. She walked around the yard for a long time, watching the shadows of the trees slide along the walls of the house, sat on the porch with a cup of coffee that was getting cold before she could take a sip. She knew that getting into this conflict wouldn't destroy her, but she also knew something else, that after it, something would remain inside that she would never forget. She gave her answer, calm, concise, confirmed by all the registration records. The house had been bought with her money, registered in her name, and her mother had had no part in the registration or financing. But the case dragged on. The trial began a few months later. Janet arrived with a lawyer, looking confident, dressed in the clothes she had had since West Curran. She talked a lot, not only in the courtroom, but in the town, where everyone already knew the story. She talked about how hard it was to raise a child alone, how much effort she had spent to make Frances achieve something. She didn't mention that she had never come to the graduation, that she hadn't sent letters, that she hadn't called in years. She said that her presence had always been a background, a silent support that had made her daughter who she had become. The first hearings were low-key. Frances was silent, collected, even. Her lawyer spoke little, but clearly. The documents confirmed her right. But it wasn't about the documents. It became a story about people trying to regain control of something they had lost long ago. Janet didn't want the house. She wanted confirmation that it was all her fault. That she had created this woman. That this house was an extension of her. Frances knew that the fight wouldn't end in court. She felt something breaking inside her, the emptiness of her childhood returning in new forms. She no longer planted grass, didn't work on new projects. Her days became shorter and her nights more disturbing. She began to wake up from dreams in which her mother stood by her bed in the dark and repeated the same sentence, "You are nothing without me." One day Frances gathered all the things she had from her childhood, old photographs, letters, school reports, and took them out to the barn. She lit a small fire and stood by it as the cards burned, the ink smeared, the frames crumbled. She didn't cry. She just held it in her eyes, the way one holds a landscape before a storm. She was out of sight, no one was filming it, but it was the biggest statement of her life. As the trial drew to a close, Janet's lawyer changed strategy. He began to press not for property but for reputation. He claimed that her daughter was dangerous, possibly mentally unstable, that she was isolating herself, that she had no contact, that she had trouble controlling her emotions. Frances had learned this from the records. She was not surprised by the lie. She was surprised by the ease with which people accepted on faith what they had not seen with their own eyes. The court had become a cold place. The exhaustion was deep. But she had endured. There was neither joy nor relief after the trial, which had left Frances with the house. The judge's decision was clear, supported by evidence, dry and unequivocal. But inside, the feeling that nothing was over did not disappear. Janet returned to West Curran, but her shadow remained in the house, in every broken gesture, in the silence of the telephone calls, in the slight doubt that now appeared even in the smallest things. Frances returned to her daily routine. She tried to live as if nothing had changed. She planted new plants, finished long-standing architectural projects, took measurements on a new object in the mountains. She worked hard, as if trying to turn fatigue into protection. But it felt as if a transparent shell had formed around her, something between reality and memories, through which it was difficult to feel any sincerity. One day, while checking her old mailbox, she found an envelope without a return address. It contained only a few sentences, written in an uncertain hand. Your father left something in the woods. If you find it, you will learn more than I wanted to say. He was silent, but he left traces. J. Frances reread the letter several times. There was something new in it, not a threat, not a demand, but a direction. Her father, though a shadow in her life, had a strange habit of leaving things in the woods behind the house. There was a small cabin there, once a storage place for tools and old things, but then it had become overgrown and disused. She hadn't been there since she was a child. She went there the next day. The woods around her seemed familiar, but with each step they took on a new sound. She followed a path that had long since disappeared under the roots, found a thicket between two oak trees, and carefully squeezed in. The cabin stood still. The roof had collapsed in one corner, and the inside smelled of old wood and mold, but everything was still standing. She opened the door and saw a shelf attached to the wall. On it lay a box. Inside were notebooks, yellowed sheets of paper, a small camera, a few negatives, a diary with dates. Her father wrote down things he had never said out loud. There were references to fatigue, to fear, to the difficulty of living with someone who demanded constant attention. He wrote about Frances, short, reserved, but with a tenderness she had never known. There was more acceptance in a few sentences than in her entire childhood. One sentence stuck in her head: I never interfered because I thought it was better. But I guess she thought I just wasn't there. The words stuck in her head for days. She took the box home and began to look through the photos. Many of them had been taken from the window. Her father had taken them when she and Janet didn't know each other. In one picture, Frances was very small, sitting in the dust, looking at a tiny flower she held in her fingers. The other pictures showed their house. In the rain, Janet's hands on the table, the empty chairs. These materials did not change the past, but they added another dimension to it. Her father, who seemed absent, was still there. He was not in words, but in observation, in the silent recording of what was happening. And perhaps this was his form of love, quiet, unspoken, but present. Frances began to go to the forest more often. She rebuilt the roof of the hut, cleared the space around it, brought an old lamp there. She did not plan anything, she just sat there for hours, reading her father's notebooks, watching the movement of light in the window opening. Over time, the place began to remind her of something valuable, not a memory, but the opportunity to be close to something real. One day she found a map among the notes, a simple one, drawn in pencil. It had markings: a stone, an old birch tree, a place by the river. She went there the next day. Among the stones she found another box. Inside were several old letters, sealed, addressed to her. In them, her father wrote that he had written them over the years, not knowing if he would ever dare to give them. He talked about how sometimes silence was not indifference, but fear of doing worse. That he had watched, seen her grow, felt guilt and admiration at the same time. That he had hoped for her. These letters had not changed her childhood. But they had opened doors she had never known. And the fact that her mother had fought for the house until then was now even more bitter because she had not known that the house, in fact, already had a real guardian. She kept those letters in the attic, in a box that had once belonged to her, from her university days. Now they were no longer photos of student projects, drawings, or sketches, but a quiet conversation with someone she had lost before she could get to know them. In the evenings, she would return to those pages, not to seek answers, but to feel something resembling a presence. Winter came quietly, without snowstorms, but with a slow cooling in the air, with a dampness that crept through the cracks in the windows. She bought a new heater, several thick blankets, but the real warmth came from the forest, from the hut that she had now come to call nothing more than her second home. In February, she noticed that someone was walking by the old fence again. The paths in the snow were too smooth, like for animals. They walked along the edge of the property, paused under an oak tree, then disappeared towards the road. At first she thought they were local teenagers playing nearby again. But then everything became clear. A few days later a registered letter arrived from a lawyer. The letter said that the mother had filed an appeal not to get the house back, but to get the inheritance divided. She no longer demanded everything, now only parts. And she gave the same arguments, that she had shaped her daughter's character, that her severity was the source of her current success, that the house should belong to both of them. Frances put the letter aside for a moment. She sat by the window in silence, watching the wind sway the bare branches. She was not surprised by the attempt itself, she was surprised by the timing. She knew that Janet would not stop, but she did not understand why. Now. Perhaps because she was not used to losing. Or perhaps because she felt something slipping away for good. The following weeks were filled with calls from lawyers, papers, clarifications. But this time, Frances did not lose her balance. She answered precisely, restrainedly, without strain. She no longer tried to justify anything. She simply defended not only the house but herself. Everything changed when the box disappeared. One morning she woke up, went up to the attic to reread the letters again, and did not find it. At first she thought that it had changed its location. She checked all the shelves, looked under the drawers, in all the old boxes. Nothing. No signs of breaking in. It was simply gone. Her first thought was her mother. But she knew she did not have the keys. And in general, for the last few months there had been no one in the house except her. Everything seemed as if the box had simply evaporated. The next day she went to the cabin in the woods, without any particular purpose, just to be in silence again. But there too she found changes. One of her father's notebooks lay open. On a page she didn't remember, it read, "What is hidden is not always gone. Sometimes it changes places, because it must be found by another way." Her father couldn't have written that, his notes were old. But someone had taken the notebook, opened it, and left something that looked like a message. She looked around the entire space in the hut, nothing else had disappeared. Only that phrase. It felt like something had begun. Over the next few days, she noticed little things. The kitchen window was slightly ajar, although she was sure to close it. One of the books on the shelf was upside down. In the study, there was a cup of water that she hadn't put down. It didn't look like an intrusion. It was more like someone walking around, as if they were at home. And then she remembered there was someone else. The man in the photo she had seen. Among her father's pictures. There he was standing next to her mother, not in his youth, but in his adulthood. His face was partially obscured, but she noticed he had a watch on his wrist, like an old mechanic from a station outside the city. The same man who hadn't been in the district for a long time. She went there, to an old station that no longer worked. There was a trailer at the entrance. There was no one in it. But on the door was a piece of paper with her name on it. Inside was a note. I knew you would come one day. He asked me to give this to you when you needed it. Now was the time. Under the note was a key to a bank vault. She didn't delay. The very next morning she went to the bank. The town was small, and people on the streets gave her the usual looks that seemed to know her, even though they didn't have any reason to. The bank branch was on the corner of the street from the cafe, where she used to drink coffee after regular meetings with lawyers, whenever she first returned to this town. But now everything felt different. The silence had become denser. The cell number 3104 opened slowly. Inside was a small box with a wooden lid, old, worn, with scratched edges. She took it without opening it and left the bank. She drove straight to the cabin in the woods, the only place she wanted to open it. She sat down on the old sofa, put the box on the table. There was a smell of dry wood in the air, thin and familiar, like when she had been a child, when she had come here with her father. Opening the lid, she saw a few things: a small notebook, a key, another note, a photograph, and a roll of paper tied with string. The photograph was black and white, of her as a child, with her father holding her, laughing. She had never seen this photograph before. Behind it was a roll, and inside it was a deed to a house. But not to the one that was her home now, but to another, a plot of land, an old structure that had once belonged to her grandmother. A story her mother had never told her. The note was short: they won't tell you the truth. But she lives there. She didn't leave you. She couldn't. They just made her. The key belonged, she guessed, to that very house. She had no plan. She didn't think she would find anything real. But she left. That same evening. Through the woods, across an old road that hadn't been repaired in years, past a town where there was almost no light. There was a house. A gray, sagging roof, closed windows. But not empty. Inside, traces of habitation. Fresh books, leftover food, neatly folded laundry. And a woman. Tall, with long gray hair, she sat silently in the corner, looking at the fire in the fireplace. Her face was familiar, but not completely. She didn't have time to think before she understood. It was her grandmother. Alive. And she was silent. Just as silently, she stood up. Approached, hugged her, without words, without explanation. Everything in the room shuddered, as if something long hidden had come out. She spent the night in that house. In the morning, her grandmother handed her another letter. Written by her father. It was about how there were things in the family that were better left unsaid. That her mother, Janet, had made everyone believe that her grandmother was dead. Because it was more convenient, in matters of inheritance, in matters of influence, in matters of control. The father found out too late and could not change anything. But he left his daughter a path she had to walk alone. When she returned to her house, the snow was already melting outside. Her mother filed another application, not for a house this time, but for compensation. The amount was astronomical. The argument, the moral effort spent on raising her. The argument, the life invested. This time, Frances didn't answer. A week later, her mother disappeared. Without leaving a trace. The police found no signs of violence. She simply left, leaving everything behind. Her car, her documents, her clothes. As if she had dissolved. The whole town was talking. But Frances was silent. A few more months passed. She registered a new property for herself. She renovated her grandmother's house. And she stayed there to live away from the city, away from her old home, away from everything that had shaped her. Only occasionally did she return to the cabin in the woods. And there, in the drawer, a box of letters appeared again. The one that had disappeared. Everything was in place. Not a trace of anyone else. But the last letter was brand new. There was no signature. Just a short phrase. Now it's all yours. But not everything is understood. Grandma's house stood quietly, as always. The windows looked out silently on the hills that stretched to the forest, where the trees were thin and tall, as if watching her. After her mother's disappearance, time seemed to change its course. The days lost their clear boundaries, and even the news that had always been in a hurry no longer reached here. The silence had become habitual. Frances was used to waking up at dawn, when it was still dark and the wind was slowly shaking the branches. She would get up, light a fire in the fireplace, heat water, and sit for a long time with a cup in her hands. Not for coffee, just to keep something warm. Horror. Thoughts were no longer in a hurry, but they didn't disappear either. They became denser. Like old books. She felt that she no longer wanted to deal with what she had called her life before. The former house remained empty. The lawyers wrote several times about documents, about inheritance, about taxes. But she did not answer anymore. She had no desire to return to what had already been taken away once, even if it was left behind for her. A few weeks after her mother disappeared, a letter arrived at the door of her grandmother's house. Not in the mailbox, not by courier. It just appeared. In a grayish envelope, without a return address. Inside was a copy of a death certificate dated several years earlier. The last name was her mother's. In the column, date of death was the year when she had just started working. When she had first acquired her own space. The document was formalized, with signatures and seals. But she knew that was impossible. Her mother could not have died while she was still present in her life, demanding, controlling. She saw her. She felt her presence. And at the same time, everything seemed plausible. Strange things began to happen. Objects that weren't there appeared in the pantry. Old books that smelled familiar. A black pair of gloves, the same ones her mother had once worn. An old comb. A wooden box with a silver button, similar to the one she had seen in her mother's drawer as a child. She couldn't find an explanation. She would go out into the yard, stand for a long time by the old oak tree where her grandmother had planted flowers. There was something in the ground that resembled movement, not living, not animal, but like a memory. Something that had been stored in the soil longer than memories. One day she woke up in the middle of the night. The door to the veranda was open. The wind was slowly swaying the curtain. By the threshold were wet, bare footprints. And a note. Again. Short. On old, crumpled paper, in a handwriting that resembled her mother's. I couldn't do it any other way. I was forced. She didn't know if it was a game or someone trying to interfere with her silence. But she began to collect what had the remains of an explanation. All the notes, things, letters. It turned out that they formed a sequence. Every date, every symbol was like a part of a larger picture. She went to the county archives. In the dusty vaults and old files, she found a document that related to her grandmother's house. It listed the name of another woman, her mother's sister, supposedly, whom she had never heard of. It turned out that this woman had lived in the same house over 30 years ago and disappeared. Missing. Her case was closed because there was no trace of her, except that she was last seen next to Frances' grandmother. On the way back, she felt a shadow fall on her mind. It was as if history was repeating itself generation after generation. No one was telling the truth, and each woman in the family had to search for the answer that the others didn't want to say. That same night she decided to open the basement. Its door was always locked. Grandma said no one had gone in there for decades. But she always wore the key around her neck, under her sweater. It was dark and damp inside. The stairs were wobbly, but she went down. The air smelled of damp, wood, and time. The ceiling was low. On the walls were old nails, rusted. In the corner was another wooden chest, wrapped in rope. She knew she had to open it. Inside was a diary. The handwriting was different, but familiar. The pages described days that had never been spoken. It was about Frances's birth. About how her grandmother had cared for her in the early years, when her mother was incapacitated. How her mother had disappeared, returned, and silenced everyone. How she took the child and drove away, leaving behind the body of her sister, who was actually Frances's biological mother. The last pages were torn, as if someone wanted to erase part of the truth, but didn't have time. And on the back cover was another line. No one is to blame. We just didn't know how to do it any other way. She came out of the basement in the early morning. Her fingers were shaking, her eyes were stinging. But she wasn't afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt something resembling clarity. Her mother wasn't her mother. And the one she considered her grandmother had been saving her whole life. And now, when all the threads had unraveled, the house was finally hers. Not because it had been passed down, but because the truth remained only in her.